Well, friends, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to address the students of Visva Bharati. The topic on which I am going to speak is neo-fascism and the assault on higher education. Basically, all over the world at this moment, there is an upsurge of fascism reminiscent of the 1930s, and some have called it neo-fascism because it's occurring within a fairly new, completely unique circumstances setup, which is quite different from the setup that existed in the 1930s. In the 1930s, what you had was different advanced capitalist countries engaged in bitter rivalry at the time, Germany versus England, Germany versus France, and so on. Well, now what you have is an absence of such rivalry, but on the other hand, you have globalized capital. Literally, capital is now going global all over the world, and therefore this is the emergence of fascism within a new context, which is why we call it neo-fascism. Now, the point is that in some of these countries, neo-fascist movements have captured power. In others, they continue to remain movements. In Germany, in France, there is Marine Le Pen. In Britain, there is UKIP. In Germany, there is AfD, and so on. I mean, in most of the European countries, you actually have neo-fascist movements, but not really neo-fascists in power. But in several countries in the world, in which, alas, we have to include India, Brazil, Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, Turkey, and so on, you actually have neo-fascists in power. Now, the question, I mean, of these, of course, India would be the closest one can think of to being called fascist. That is because of the fact that the main body behind this fascist movement, which is the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, is a very old body. It's not a new movement. It is a movement which has been there since 1925. It has actually seen classical fascism and has professed sympathy with it. As a matter of fact, the RSS ideologue Dr. Munje had actually gone to meet Mussolini. And we also know that Golwalkar, who was the second Sarasanchalak of the RSS, had professed sympathy for the way that Hitler had treated the Jews. So they made no secret of their sympathy for classical fascism even at that time. As a matter of fact, the contrast between the Indian anti-colonial struggle on the one hand and the RSS and the Hindu right on the other towards fascism at that time is best illustrated by a story. You know, when Jawaharlal Nehru was returning to India after the death of his wife Kamala Nehru, you remember she was in a sanatorium in Switzerland, and after that, when he was returning, the plane he was coming back by had a stopover in Rome. Mussolini had sent an emissary to take Nehru out of the plane. It was a halt for a couple of hours to take Nehru out of the plane for an audience with Il Duce, which means an audience with Mussolini. Nehru was adamantly opposed to the idea, and as a result, for the entire 2-hour stopover, he simply stayed in the plane, didn't get down from the plane, and kept arguing with Mussolini's emissary that he had no intentions of getting down and meeting Il Duce. In other words, the Indian anti-colonial struggle was very clear that it would steer clear of the fascist government that had come up in Europe. But on the other hand, at the very same time, the Hindu right was building bridges with, expressing sympathy with the fascist governments of Europe. So, of the various neo-fascist movements of today, perhaps the Indian one is the one that would be closest to classical fascism in our country, precisely because its ideology has been fashioned over a period of time and certainly been influenced by that of classical European fascism. The question which immediately arises is, why is it that all over the world you have this upsurge of neo-fascism? Now, fascism arises whenever there is a crisis of capitalism. In the 1930s, that was the case. In the 1930s, there was a Great Depression, huge unemployment, and that unemployment generated the conditions in which the fascists could come to power in Germany and Italy and so on. Likewise, there is a crisis today in world capitalism, a crisis of neoliberal capitalism, which is causing massive unemployment everywhere. This crisis of neoliberal capitalism obviously makes the position of the big capitalists, of monopoly capital, that much more vulnerable, because obviously any moment you can find, because of the acute miseries through which the working class, the working people all over the world are passing, you may find an upsurge of radical movements, you may find anti-capitalist sentiments arising, you may find anti-monopoly sentiments arising, and therefore big capital, to preempt any such possibility and to ensure that the neoliberal policies which have brought it to the forefront continue to be pursued, it actually promotes fascism. Fascism is always promoted by monopoly capital. We know in our country the two well-known big business houses which are behind Modi, everybody knows about them. As a matter of fact, in every country in the world, behind fascist movements are big business houses. These big business houses, particularly new upstart big business houses. We know the ones we are talking about in India. They are to be contrasted, let us say, with Bajaj and others, the older capitalists, who of course don't oppose the emergence of fascism, but on the other hand, who are much less sanguine about them, much less sympathetic about them. So fascism is always supported by monopoly capital, particularly monopoly capital, which is big, new, upstart monopoly capital. Now that's exactly what has happened in our country. They do so in order to bring about a discourse shift, so that people are not talking about unemployment, people are not talking about the crisis that confronts them. They're not talking about difficulties of material living, but they are talking about the other. Fascism always floats the other as the enemy. Fascism always floats a discourse where the other becomes the enemy. The other is also blamed for the economic crisis, but on the other hand, even when you're not talking about the economic crisis, fascism is always, as it were, kind of, focusing on the other as the cause of people's distress, the cause of people's humiliation, and so on and so forth. This other is typically a hapless minority. In Germany, it was the Jews. You'd be amazed to know that in Germany, which had a population at that time of 70 million, 7 crores, the total number of Jews in that country were 5 lakhs. 0.7% of the population, not even 1%. And yet, they were made to be the hated objects, the reasons for Germany's misfortune and so on. And I mean, it just defies reason. Therefore, fascism puts the blame for the travails of the ordinary people on the other, including even the economic travails on the other. The other is held responsible for the difficulties, and the discourse shift which fascism brings about for this reason, in this manner, is something which is approved by monopoly capital, because you're not blaming the system. You're not saying that the unemployment exists because in capitalism there's a crisis, but you're saying unemployment exists because the Dalit is taking away the jobs, because the earlier Manmohan Singh government was really pampering these people. The Muslim is taking away the job because the earlier government was pampering these people. Therefore, there is a complete discourse shift where the other is foregrounded as the enemy. And the majority community is supposed to fall in line behind the fascists in foregrounding the other as the enemy. Now, this obviously is something which defies reason. It is impossible on the basis of any rational argumentation to believe that the Dalit or the Muslim, etc., are responsible for the travails, the economic travails of the majority population, or are responsible in any way for all the distress that the majority population may have been subjected to. Therefore, it becomes very important for fascism to make sure that rational discourse is cut out, that an essential component of fascism, which represents a discourse shift by putting the other as the center of people's difficulties and distress and travails, an essential component of fascism is the destruction of reason, because no rational argumentation can possibly support such a proposition. As I said, in Germany, for instance, 7 crore Germans and 5 lakh Jews. To imagine that these 5 lakh Jews were responsible for the misery of the 7 crore Germans is absurd. It is laughable. But on the other hand, it is something which Hitler harped on, the Nazis harped on, and in order to make this laughable proposition credible, it's important to attack reason. It's important to attack rational discourse. It's important to attack rational reason of argumentation. Now, typically in all our societies, reasonable argumentation occurs above all in institutions of higher learning, which basically means universities, colleges, and so on. And therefore, attacking universities and colleges, ensuring that universities and colleges cease to play the role of accommodating reasoned discourse, accommodating rational argumentation, becomes an obsession with the fascists. This is exactly the kind of obsession which we are seeing at this moment. We are seeing in this moment in our country an attack on all the major institutions of higher learning, whether it is Jawaharlal Nehru University, whether it is Jamia Millia, whether it is Delhi University, whether it's Visva Bharati University, whether it's Hyderabad Central University, in all the universities, and mind you, it's not only universities, Pune Film Institute, the Fine Arts Department of MS University Baroda, all the centers for excellence, which were known all over the world for being places for reasoned discourse, are the centers which are under attack. It is amazing. You ask yourself, how is it and why is it that the BJP government is so hell-bent on destroying JNU? I mean, if you don't like JNU, build another one. You build your own JNU, you build your own university, let it in fact outcompete JNU. But no, the desire is not so much to build your own thing, to outcompete JNU, but the desire is to destroy JNU. And why do you want to destroy it? Because you want to get rid of any possibility of reasoned discourse that would immediately see the absurdity of the argumentation which holds the other as being responsible for the ills of a particular society. Now, this particular desire to destroy acquires a special strength in our context compared even to the 1930s. Why? Because you see, in the 1930s, when Hitler came to power, he actually, or the fascists generally, whether it's Japan, whether it's Germany, they actually brought about an improvement in the economic conditions of the people. How did they do that? They actually substantially increased military spending. They were preparing for a war. They substantially increased military spending. This military spending was financed by government borrowing, which means by deficit, increased government expenditure for rearming Germany and Japan, and therefore brought about an increase in employment. In fact, Japan was the first country to overcome the Great Depression in 1931, when there was a military fascist government that took over. Likewise, Germany in Europe was the first country to overcome the Great Depression in 1933, when Germany started rearming. The liberal bourgeois countries like Britain or United States and so on, they came out of the depression much later. Only around 1938, when they, under the threat of war, started rearming themselves. Therefore, there was a period between, let's say, in Germany in 1933 and 1939, when the Second World War began, a period of 6 years, during which the fascists were quite popular. They were quite popular because they had overcome the rigors of the Great Depression, and at the same time the horrors of the war had not started. Yes, some preliminary wars had started, like taking over Austria and so on, but the horrors of the Second World War had not really even started. Therefore, there was a period in which the fascists had substantial popular support. While when you look at today's neo-fascists, when they're in power, let us say in India, what actually happens is that, as I mentioned, today we live in a world of globalized capital, globalized finance. Now, finance does not like fiscal deficits, never. But on the other hand, during that period, since the fascists were very close national finance, which was dominant at that time, they could persuade national finance that, all right, we are going to spend and enlarge employment and so on. Enlarge employment not as a welfare measure, but as a means of rearming Germany. But on the other hand, today, you have globalized finance, and therefore, and you have nation states. No particular country, no particular nation state, not even a neo-fascist nation state, can really confront globalized finance. Therefore, the capacity of the neo-fascist nation state to carry out a fiscal deficit and enlarge demand in order to generate larger employment, even if this employment is meant for some nefarious purposes and not as a welfare measure, that capacity itself is very, very limited. Because, as I said, today's neo-fascism is really operating within an environment that is dominated by globalized finance. In the 1930s, you had German finance capital, British finance capital, French finance capital, and so on, but not international finance capital. Today, it's a very different situation when you find that there's German finance capital, you have no German or Indian or American or British finance capital, but you have globalized finance capital, which, so even if you have a neo-fascist government, if the neo-fascist government persists with a fiscal deficit for any length of time, since finance does not like fiscal deficits because it tends to undermine the legitimacy of capitalism. People begin to ask, if you need the government to generate employment, then why should we have the capitalists? So because it undermines the legitimacy of capitalism, finance capital does not like fiscal deficits, and as a result, if a country persists in having fiscal deficits, finance capital would leave that country, creating a massive problem here, unless the country drops out of the entire process of globalization, neoliberal globalization, which, unless it is actually a left-wing radical regime, would not have the courage to do so. And as we know, the neo-fascists in India or elsewhere they all swear by neoliberal globalization. They all swear by being open to capital flows, globalized capital flows. As a matter of fact, the government of India has a slogan of Atmanirbhar Bharat. Atmanirbhar doesn't mean that in India, Indian capital or Indian public sector is going to produce the things we need. It means that you, foreign capital, please come to India, locate your plants here, and that way we shall become Atmanirbhar. We shall become Atmanirbhar by raising our level of investment, and we shall do so by inviting foreign capital. Therefore, no neo-fascist government today, whether it's in India, whether it's in Brazil, nowhere, no neo-fascist government is in a position to overcome unemployment, is in a position to overcome the misery of the people. Yesterday, I read an article which has plausibility, namely that in India, because there is so much unemployment, people tend to drop out of the workforce. Therefore, the worker participation ratio, or in other words, the workforce to population ratio, is lower in India than in many other countries. If you take the world average of workforce to population ratio, I mean, if you take, for instance, what prevails in the advanced countries, then you'll find that in India, unemployment rate is as much as 40%. So a lot of it is camouflaged because of the discouraged worker effect, that people don't want to even appear to be looking for jobs, even looking for jobs because what's the point? Therefore, in this acute unemployment, the neo-fascists can play no positive role. Therefore, neo-fascism today has this characteristic that it is intrinsically incapable of playing a positive role in reviving or rescuing the economy, in providing succor to the people, in providing assistance. That being the case, it becomes all the more necessary to actually divide the people by creating this myth of the other, that they are out to destroy our country. There are international conspiracies going on everywhere. If someone is seen talking to someone else on the street corner, then obviously they are plotting against the country, and therefore sedition laws should be employed against them. The whole paranoia that is generated by the government is really a way of camouflaging the fact that they are incapable of providing any constructive solution to the nation's problems. They are incapable of providing greater employment, incapable of providing any kind of succor to the people. Now, in that connection, precisely because rational discourse would poo-poo this paranoia, rational discourse would call this paranoia absurd, the attack on rational discourse would also intensify in the days to come. And consequently, the attack on institutions of higher learning would be stepped up, would be scaled up in the days to come. And this is something that all of us have to be prepared to countenance. I think Visva Bharati has done a remarkable job in facing up to such attacks. I think JNU has been facing up to these attacks for a very long time. But on the other hand, there is no doubt also that precisely because this neo-fascism has no positive contribution to make, there's nothing it can do that actually is to the good of the people. Its life in that sense is also limited because of the fact that, look, I mean, sooner or later people are going to say that, look, these fellows came to power promising jobs, nothing has happened. They came to power promising to double the income of agriculturists. Now they are out to smash the farming community in the country. They came to power promising that, I mean, all kinds of things, but on the other hand, they have achieved nothing. Therefore, their bluff is called very early. And that being the case, if we have the capacity to withstand this onslaught, which the government is going to raise precisely in the days to come, precisely because their capacity to bring about any positive contribution is non-existent, two things happen. On the one hand, they have to attack with even greater vigor the intelligentsia, the minorities, and so on. They have to kind of, inculcate this myth with even greater vigor, the myth of the other, the myth of the conspiracy which the other is hatching against the country, the myth of this being surrounded by enemies who are really out to destroy this country. As a matter of fact, people doing the destruction are precisely those who are creating divisions among the people, creating this paranoia. But on the other hand, this paranoia is generated because the ability to bring about an improvement in the conditions of the people is not non-existent. That being the case, somehow you have to appeal to the people on some other grounds. As I said, a discourse shift then becomes necessary. And this discourse shift is one which is going to become even more and more acute. The paranoia is going to become more and more acute. And therefore, the attack on the universities, on colleges, on centers of higher learning is going to become even more serious. But it has the other side. Precisely because it has zero positive contribution, it's very easy to see that nothing is happening, nothing positive is happening, that actually people are being fed paranoid myths rather than bread and butter, rather than jobs, rather than material means of subsistence. And therefore, this fascism also can be overcome much quicker than fascism earlier had been. Nothing, to my mind, illustrates the kind of irrationality that informs government policies today than the fact that the UGC is asking universities to teach about cow science. There's a UGC circular asking universities that please teach about cow science. While all universities, not veterinary colleges and universities, for them is a part of their syllabus, but all universities, JNU has to teach cow science, in my economics department I have to teach cow science and so on. While at the same time, young people, young idealist people like Disha Ravi, who are concerned about climate change, who are really agitating for us to become more aware about the problems of climate change, who really represent the most advanced form of reason, are being harassed, are being arrested, and so on. Nothing can be more illustrative of the destruction of reason that is taking place in the country than what this particular episode is actually illustrating. This is, as I said, not a new phenomenon. We have seen this before. This is exactly what had happened in the 1930s. This is something which is happening today. There are historical patterns of similarity and differences, some of which I've talked about. But the point is that I would like to congratulate these students of Visva Bharati for the remarkable courage, for the remarkable resilience that they have shown in confronting this kind of fascist onslaught. All power to you, and I hope you would continue to confront this fascist onslaught, because ultimately there is no doubt that victory would be of reason, that ultimately victory is ours. Thank you very much for your patience. You see, there is a big difference between fascism and any kind of authoritarianism, just simple authoritarianism. One difference I have already mentioned, which consists in the fact that fascism has an ideology of targeting the other. While authoritarianism is just plain authoritarianism, it comes down heavily on all citizens, that you kind of do what we are ask you to do, otherwise you're going to be in trouble. Fascism is an ideology. It divides the people. And many people these days ask about whether how this compares with Indira Gandhi's emergency and so on and so forth. In fact, in the emergency, there was no Hindu-Muslim riot. There was no Hindu-Muslim feeling. There was no communal feeling. There was no feeling of promoting upper caste against the kind of Dalits and so on. There was none of all that. It was a straightforward, the state versus the people. While fascism as an ideology, and that ideology tries to isolate a hapless minority and to rouse the majority into anger and hatred against this hapless minority. But there's a second difference between fascism and authoritarianism, that which is linked to this, that authoritarianism is simply the use of state organs against the citizens, while fascism is both the use of state organs vis-a-vis the citizens and also the use of hoodlums, the use of fascist stormtroopers, the use of fascist youth wings and so on. You know, in other words, fascism not only has the character of being repressive, it also has the character of putting youths on the streets. It has the character of throwing hoodlums on the people. Now, this is exactly what we find in our country, that it's not just the Delhi police or this police or that police or the NIA or the Enforcement Directorate, which are let loose on the people, but you also find that there is an army of people trolling anyone who actually says anything which is based on reason. You actually find, for instance, ministers saying Disha Ravi should actually be exterminated. I mean, can you imagine this? This is absurd. So you have the hoodlum element of fascism. Fascism, therefore, has a kind of mass character in which you have mass hoodlums being thrown on the streets, or being thrown these days, of course, streets are not the place where you have this happening. You have this on social media and so on, being thrown on the social media in order to attack reason. One remarkable thing which has happened is, of course, the farmers' movement. The farmers' movement is remarkable because against all provocations, against all repression, they have held firm. There is a new farm unity among them, and they are concerned with bread and butter issues. They are concerned with the future of farming. They are concerned with not the other. They are not concerned with being anti-Muslim. They are not. Mind you, these are the same farmers who had actually been behind the Muzaffarnagar riots that brought Modi to power. But on the other hand, the same farmers of Western UP now are making common cause with Muslims on an issue which is of immediate concern for both segments of the population. So the more people unite on secular issues of bread and butter, the more, in fact, they would be able to take on the Modi administration or the BJP government, which is forever trying to make sure that these issues are kept to the background and that issues of communal divide are really foregrounded. We have to be very careful about that, and we have to watch out against that effort to divide people. Thank you.